Hi, I'm Eric Vanneman. I'm an associate professor in psychology. I'm also a social neuroscientist at the University of Queensland. And I wanted to go ahead and share with you some of my book recommendations. I really like to read and I like to see what other people recommend. And so I thought, I'd pay it forward a little bit and tell you about some of my favorite books from the past year in 2022. Now, the way I come up with the books that I read is, a little bit of like seeing things mentioned in the media, reading newspapers, whatever. But one of my main ways that I learn about books is from Goodreads, a website where I think it's actually owned by Amazon. And at Goodreads, I have some friends that I follow and they follow me, and I get to see what they're reading and they make little reviews. And some other books are just sort of brand new books that I haven't heard about, and I'll go ahead and type it into Goodreads to see what other people in the community have said about the book. So Goodreads is really kind of an important place for me to go to in terms of social media and how I find books. And if you want, you can go ahead and follow me there, or you can friend me, and I love to see what books you actually are reading too. Now, one of the things that Goodreads has is they have an annual challenge where you can pick how many books you want to read, set it as a goal, and then you can keep track of it as you go throughout the year. And in 2022, my goal was to read 35 books. And so set that as my goal, and I actually made it. I got to 35 books by December 30th. So what were the 35 books that I read? Well, you can see here, I'm going to scroll through them here from my Goodreads year in review page. Number one was Hail Mary by Andy Weir, First Love by Ivan Turgenev, The Year of Magical Thinking, which was just a stage version, by Joan Didion, The Genetic Lottery by Catherine Page Hardin, The Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, Verity by Colleen Hoover, Stolen Focus by Johan Hari, Behave by Robert Sapolsky, Stoner by John Williams, Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood, The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, The War for Kindness by Jamil Zaki, The Other Husband by Catherine Croft, The Thief by Fuminori Nakamura, The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han, Book Lovers by Emily Henry, The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power, Beach Read by Emily Henry, Burn Rate by Andy Dunn, Mercury Pictures Presents by Anthony Mara, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry, This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar, The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, and in number 35, the last book I read was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Now, I did read 35 books, and I don't want to talk about all 35 of them here. So what I'm going to do instead is give you sort of my favorites from the nonfiction and fiction list. So 5 books I recommend from fiction, 5 books I read from nonfiction, plus a couple runner-ups. I'll also tell you about 3 books I didn't like very much, and I recommend to you not read them. But I'm not telling you not to read them, just saying I didn't enjoy them, so perhaps you wouldn't enjoy them either. My goal, by the way, is that in the future, I'm going to try to do this on a monthly basis and talk about all the books I read that month. And because my goal in 2023 is to read 50 books a year, I'm going to try to do 5 books a month. I'll have like 4 or 5 books I can talk in more detail every month about whether or not I like them or not, instead of having this long, gigantic list here and have this entire year to talk about in one go. All right, let's look at my nonfiction list. So I have 5 books on the nonfiction list that I enjoyed reading. The first one is Stolen Focus by Johan Hari. Its subtitle is Why You Can't Pay Attention. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Hari is not a psychologist, and in fact, he's a journalist, and as a journalist, he doesn't do the best job of talking about all of the research and properly documenting primary sources and so on. There's been some excellent criticisms of this book that Hari kind of relies more on secondary sources to talk about attention and what we know about it. But I still found it a very useful, challenging book to think about attention. And attention, according to Hari, is actually being slowly eroded by modern life. That because of things like smartphones and the way we have so many things we have to pay attention to in our environment at the same time, we're actually hurting our attention spans. We're not focusing as well as we might have in the past because of all these things that are around us to distract us. And of course, that's a pretty controversial, sort of strong argument to make. And really, like I said, the research isn't really there yet in psychology. Even though this is a really big area in psychology to study attention, Hari doesn't really go that well into talking about the research that shows that our attention is waning. I still think it's useful to bring this up as a possible warning about things going on in the future. Not only does he talk about social media and smartphones, and he himself gave up his smartphone for several months to see how that would go and how that would affect his focus. He talks about things like nutrition and environmental pathogens that can also have an effect on our brain development and how we focus. So there's a lot here to unpack. And I recommend this book if you just want to get into that general topic, but then maybe follow it up by starting to look at some of the literature about what we know about attention. Now, the second book I have here that I want to recommend is Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull. It was published in 2014. Ed Catmull is one of the founders of Pixar, and he later ended up running the company. Thus, this book has plenty of great stories about all of your favorite Pixar movies, the behind-the-scenes stories of the development of the Toy Story franchise, Ratatouille, Monsters, Inc., The Incredibles. So many great stories about how these movies came about and how Ed Catmull, being right there in the thick of everything, kind of was responsible for putting creativity teams together that worked on these projects. I mean, each of these films requires hundreds and hundreds of people working together to create this product over maybe a 2-year period. And so as a result, Catmull becomes this really important leader at Pixar. And as he was coming close to retirement, I guess, he wrote this book as partly like maybe his recollection of the history of Pixar from back, when he met Steve Jobs and all of these first movies that they made together, to the final movies that he worked on. And all along the way, not only is he talking about the history of the company, he's sprinkling it with all sorts of management advice, how you can manage particularly a team of creative people. I found this really interesting and relevant even to me, who manages a small lab group, in terms of how do you make sure that individuals thrive in their creativity, that you don't become too domineering with your own ideas. How do you help people get through those moments when it can be really tough? For example, one of the things that happened in one of the Toy Story movies is that they lost the entire drive or some backup system of one of the movies. All of the work they had done just disappeared because someone accidentally erased it. And it took several months for them to kind of recover from that. They did find that someone had made a backup copy that was older, but it really set back the entire company, and everybody sort of lost a lot of their drive, their initiative about that movie. And Catmull had to figure out how to get everybody back on board again and get them excited. He's also got stuff in there about how do you deal with problematic people. And there were some problematic people they had at Pixar that they had to basically manage out of the company. Maybe you're not really into business management, but because it's Pixar and because it's written in a really nice style, I really recommend it. I think I learned a lot from it for somebody who's not really trained in business or management at all, while at the same time enjoying stories about one of my favorite set of films, these Pixar movies. My number 3 nonfiction book is The Education of an Idealist, written by Samantha Power back in 2019. Now, Samantha Power is an incredible person. If you don't know who she is, Samantha Power was the ambassador for the United States to the United Nations in the Obama administration's second term. She did this, and she was only like around 40 or so when she was appointed to this. But she had already, prior to becoming appointed the ambassador to the UN, had become quite important to Obama's central cabinet, to the way that that group worked together. She had to do a lot with the foreign policy that was developed during the Obama years. And prior to that, she had been a journalist who had spent a lot of time in Kosovo and had seen a lot about what happens during genocide and wrote a very important book about genocide. Just really a fascinating person. And all along, she's also dealing with all sorts of private issues, like things going on with her family. She was actually an Irish immigrant who, when she was a girl, her mother moved her from Ireland to the United States, leaving her father behind, and who she didn't see for a long time because her parents had divorced and they weren't speaking to each other. But she eventually has to make peace with that. She has to deal with all sorts of other issues that come up in her life. It's really an amazing story about an amazing woman. And I enjoyed this book. It's a very long book, but I think I read it all in about a week because I just found it so riveting, the stories that she was telling, both about international diplomacy as well as the things going on in her everyday life. My next nonfiction book is Burn Rate, that came out in 2022. Now, this is written by Andy Dunn. Now, the way I found out about this book is kind of interesting. What happened was that my son and I were visiting Boston, and we went over to Harvard one day, and we were at Harvard University. We went into the Coop bookstore, which is one of the main bookstores there for Harvard, where you can find all of the textbooks that are required each semester. And I usually walk over to the psychology section to see what my colleagues in the psychology department at Harvard are having their students read. And one of the books that was on the shelf there was this book. And this book was listed under, I think, an abnormal psychology course. And so I was intrigued. I thought, this is a brand new book. This person who, I didn't know anything about this book. And so I thought, I'm going to go read it. So I actually read it in the next week, and I very much enjoyed it. Andy Dunn is an entrepreneur, a young guy who, right out of university and doing his MBA, started up a successful company called Bonobos, which was a clothing store for men. And they had basically, I think it was like an online presence in the United States with like pop-up stores around the place that you could go to. And Bonobos became very big. It had like hundreds of millions of dollars in investments. And I think in the end, he did sell the store and made a lot of money from it. But all along, he was suffering from bipolar disorder. And so he has to deal with the fact that he has bipolar. And for a long time, for many years, he didn't even know that he had bipolar. He hadn't been diagnosed properly. And so therefore, it was untreated. And he was having these episodes, these manic episodes where he just did things that were just plain crazy to everybody in his life and possibly could have ruined some of his business ventures and his relationship. It wasn't until much later that he actually found the right psychologist or psychiatrist, I can't remember who it was that helped him, but he got medication, he started to get some therapy for his bipolar and sort of got it under control, but he lives with it every day. And so it's a very frank memoir about what it's like to have bipolar disorder. I recommend it. If you've known anybody who has bipolar or you have bipolar yourself, you might find this book inspiring and really, really fascinating. The fifth book on my nonfiction list of recommendations is 4,000 Weeks, written by Oliver Burkeman. It's Time Management for Mortals, as you can see here. Now, I've actually made another video about this book, and specifically talking about how to move FOMO to JOMO, how to take the fear of missing out and change it to the joy of missing out. But the book itself is much bigger than just that thing that's captured in my video. The title, by the way, refers to the idea that if you live to about the age of 80, you'll have about 4,000 weeks in your life to live. And when you think about it in terms of just 4,000 weeks, then it's meant to give you a sense that you have a more limited time here on the earth than we normally want to admit. And he's making the argument in this book is that because we tend to not want to admit our limitations in terms of how we don't really have that long of a life, and that with the life that we have, we don't have that many free hours in the day. We only have so many resources. And yet what we do is we overcommit. We tell ourselves that we can do all these different things. We'll have time for that later and so on. And we never really do. And so therefore we end up being unhappy a lot of the time because we have sold ourselves short by not recognizing that we have this limited capacity to deal with many things. And so that's sort of his message. Not that you can cram more things into your life if you follow his advice, but more that you need to acknowledge that you have only a limited amount of time and a limited amount of resources. So you need to start saying no and start focusing on fewer things to accomplish on your to-do list. I found this book really illuminating. I very much enjoyed it, and I really recommend it to you. I do have an honorable mention on this nonfiction list, and that's Matthew Perry's book about friends, lovers, and the big thing, the big terrible thing. This was published in 2022, And this book has gotten a lot of flack. I actually enjoyed it. It's a memoir by Matthew Perry from Friends. I'll tell you personally, one of the reasons why I wanted to read this book was that very early on in the history of the Friends television franchise, I think it was probably like about the 12th episode, I got to go in Hollywood to go see the taping of that first season of Friends, just this one episode. And so I got to go there on a Friday night, sit there for several hours while they taped an entire Friends episode. And so there I am watching this episode being filmed, and they would frequently have breaks in which you could see, which everybody got up and stretched and went around and got something to eat or something. And I remember very clearly Matthew Perry coming out into the audience and talking to some of his family members during one of these breaks. He was up off to the left up there, talking to his friends or family. I don't know who they were exactly, but he was obviously very close to him. And I just remember thinking at the time, wow, he's just a normal guy who's got family. He wants to go see them. Kind of reminded me if you were in a high school production or something, you want to go out and see your family during the intermission. And then he went back and he was back being Chandler again on Friends. Well, anyway, this memoir comes out and I had to read it. I read, though, a lot of negative reviews about it. And I think the reason why is that a lot of people think it's just going to be this sort of glossy, happy recollection of what it's like to have been on Friends, one of the most popular TV shows of all time. And it's got some of that in there. There's plenty of really cool stories that Matthew Perry can share about the fact, for instance, that he knew Jennifer Aniston before he actually was on Friends, and that he had even asked her out and she turned him down. But really, most of the book is about his struggles with addiction. And we're talking about major, major struggles with addiction, doing alcohol, different kinds of drugs, really just having a hard time with his life, been in and out of rehab dozens and dozens and dozens of times, has had many counselors, many people ripping him off, spending millions of dollars for treatment. So it's really the story about addiction and how addiction can get out of control. And even for somebody as quote unquote successful as Matthew Perry, and somebody you would think would have everything that he could possibly want, how in the world could he be in a position where he'd have such a struggle with addiction? That's what this book is about, to help you see how damaging addiction can be, not only for that individual, Matthew Perry, who spends a lot of time by himself in this book because he can't even face other people while he's engaging in his different addictions, but also just how it affects all the other people in his life, his loved ones, his friends, the fact that he has a hard time ever holding on to a girlfriend because of these problems that he has with his addiction. So I really found it very illuminating, found it very, my main reaction after reading the book was, I just want to give Matthew Perry a big hug and tell him it's going to be okay. So that's how I came about liking this book and recommend it to you. All right, let's go to the fiction list. Now, the fiction list I'll go a little bit faster on, but I'll talk about, first of all, the number one book I have on the list here is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, that was published in 2014. This book, by the way, has gotten a lot of press. It's quite a famous book. In fact, I think it's being made into a TV series. It's about a German boy and a French girl, and for most of the book, she's in France, he's in Germany, and you just wonder how in the world are they ever going to get together? That is, each chapter kind of just goes back and forth between, the girl in France, and then the next chapter is the boy in Germany, and you're thinking, these seem like two completely unrelated stories, except that it's happening during World War II. But of course, they do get together. Somehow their stories or their lives are going to intersect, and there'll be something really important that happens when it does. I can't really say much more than that, because then that would go ahead and give away the entire book to you. But I really found this book just amazing. I mean, it's really, really good. I have to say that it took me about 50 pages in before I really started liking it, because I think I found it sort of disruptive, this jumping back and forth between the French girl and the German boy, and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But once I started to get an idea of how this might all come together and what the overall story was, and besides that, I kind of like these stories about the German occupation of France. I don't know why. I always find these kind of novels that take place in that time period really riveting. And so it was really good and really interesting. And I bet the movie's going to be fantastic. Now, the second book I have on my list is really going to seem strange to you, but it's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, published back in 1818. Wow, what a weird, wonderful book. I have to just say that if you think you know what Frankenstein is, or you've never read this book, you don't know that what we've seen in movies and television, our kind of modern conceptualization of Frankenstein, has no real bearing to this book. In fact, remember that you might know this, but the Frankenstein actually refers to the scientist in the book who creates this creature. He's called the creature throughout the book. The creature is a result of Dr. Frankenstein trying to reanimate dead tissue, like trying to make things that are dying, make them come alive. So he's trying to find out what it is about life that you could do, magically or scientifically, I should say, to make things come back to life. Now, they don't get into the details of it, but I think it involves electricity, and this causes the creature to be born, and he's a reanimated dead tissue. And when he comes alive, he's basically got the mind and the feelings and so on of the human that he was before, but he's hideous. He looks ugly because he's got all these different parts attached to him in order to make himself alive. And so whenever the creature appears in front of anybody else, he scares them. He even scares Dr. Frankenstein to the point where they just scream and run away. And because he's had such bad experiences with people, the creature has to kind of live in hiding. He has to live out in the woods and come and steal food because he gets hungry. And it's just a miserable, terrible life that he has. He eventually comes back to Dr. Frankenstein and begs him and says, I'm incredibly lonely. I can't hang out with any humans on Earth. I really don't know what to do, but I would really like to have a companion. Could you please make me like a companion, like the bride of Frankenstein, kind of. And Dr. Frankenstein, who's just so horrified that he's made this creature in the first place, says, no way, I'm not making another one. And that's the end of that. And when Dr. Frankenstein says no, that causes the creature just to go off the deep end. And the creature is going to have his vengeance against Dr. Frankenstein for not putting him out of his lonely misery. So, and in fact, what you can kind of see this as a story is about the fact that Dr. Frankenstein has no empathy for this creature that he's created. It has all sorts of ramifications for things like, do we have empathy for other animals that are not human, for people that we don't think of as being human or part of our group, even robots, like, are we going to have empathy for robots? And these are all topics, by the way, that in my psychology research, I'm really interested in, and I just recently got a grant about. So I found this just really amazing that back in this time period that this book Mary Shelley wrote really kind of addressed a lot of these very issues that I'm interested in. And so you could say that maybe the subtitle was Frankenstein, a tragedy about empathy or something. Interestingly, the word empathy didn't really appear in the English language the way we use it today until about 100 years ago. So I'm not exactly sure what word they would have used back then to talk about this concept, but that's what I think of this book when I read it. Now, the next one I have on my list is Stoner, that was published in 1965. This is a very little known book. And, like I said, it's 1965, so it's getting close to 60 years old. And the only reason why this book seems to be around these days is that some sort of hipster people or celebrities or somebody have recommended the book in the last 20 years, and now it has regained in its popularity. So what is Stoner about? Well, this book written by John Williams is written in a very plain sort of factual style about a boy who who grew up on a farm, who is going to take over the farm eventually, but his dad and he agree that he should go off to university and major in agriculture so he can kind of learn about the newest methods in agriculture and come back and do the farm. But the problem is that this character, Stoner is his last name, when he goes off to university, he actually falls in love with English literature. And he changes his major then to English and eventually gets his Ph.D. or gets a master's and a Ph.D. and becomes a professor of English at that university. And so he gives up the farm life and teaches English. So along the way, he has, relationships. He gets married to somebody who doesn't really love him very much. He has an affair with a student. He gets involved in a lot of horrible departmental politics that I can relate to. So there's just a lot of really interesting things going on in this book. And even though it's written in this very plain style, I thought the story was captivating. And at the end, it was just, it was a very poignant, moving book. And when I finished it, I happened to run into somebody else and recommended this book to her, and she ended up loving it as well. So I'm hoping by telling you about it, and maybe one or two of you will pick up this book and read it, that you too will find it as fantastic as I did. It's really amazing this isn't more of a classic than it actually is. All right, I got two last books here on my fiction list. Number 4 is Remarkably Bright Creature, Shelby Van Pelt, that came out in 2022. This is the first novel by Van Pelt, and the three main characters in this book are a 30-year-old slacker character, a guy, a woman who's around 70 who's a cleaning woman, and an octopus. An octopus who's found in like a local aquarium, like a local town aquarium. Yes, an octopus. And in fact, the octopus has a lot of narration in the book. There's chapters where you just hear what the octopus thinks. And it might seem to you then that this is a book of magical realism. We're going to have talking animals interacting with the humans, but it's not like that. In fact, the octopus never really does talk to the humans. The humans don't hear him speaking. And I read somewhere that Van Pelt really tried to make sure that the octopus's behaviors, at least from what the humans see, are completely realistic kinds of behaviors that octopuses would do. They're very clever creatures, and this octopus is very clever. But in the storytelling, the octopus and the two humans all come together somehow. Like, this is, again, the basis of the whole book, how these three stories are going to weave together. And it's just such a touching story. I really, really liked it. I was almost sad to have it end when it finished because I really liked the characters so much, including the octopus. So there's that book to recommend. And number 5 is My Brilliant Friend by Italian author Elena Ferrante, that was published in 2011. It takes place in Naples, Italy, and it's the first book in a series of 4 novels called the Neapolitan novels. So the idea now is that I've read this first book, I'm supposed to read the next 3, and I probably will. It's about 2 girls who are growing up together in Naples in the 1950s and the things that go on in their neighborhood and how they deal with their parents and boys and all sorts of things that go on at school. It is so very descriptive that I really think I could see clearly everything that was going on in their Naples neighborhood. I felt like I was reading some sort of epic novel, like something that's going to go on and on for years and years. I just really got caught up in the characters. And when I finished the book, I thought, yeah, I'm going to have to go ahead and read those next 3 novels now in the coming year. Now, interestingly, while I was reading this book, I actually happened to be watching The White Lotus, which was on television, and this was season 1 that I happened to be watching, the one that takes place in Hawaii. And the character of Rachel in one of the scenes is sitting there reading My Brilliant Friend by the pool. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I thought, what's the significance of her reading this book? And I went and read about it, and here's what I found, is that the creator of the show said, "I love Elena Ferrante's books, but they are a little trendy. Rachel is not someone who's going to go reading some obscure book," he told the Wall Street Journal. "It made me feel like she's a smart reader, but she's also trendy, maybe a little behind the trend." I guess that describes me. I think of myself as a smart reader. I guess I must be a little trendy and I'm behind the trend because this book came out a while ago. But here it is, 2022. I read the book. I enjoyed it. Recommend it to you. For honorable mentions, I'm going to say on this one, Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Emily Henry writes romantic comedy type books, and they're really easy kind of summer reads, fun to read. The 2 main characters in this book have this great bickering that goes on for most of the book that I really enjoyed. And even at the end of the book, I think I shed a tear because the story got sort of very sentimental at the end. I really enjoyed this book. It was a quick read. I think I read it on the plane when I was flying between the United States and Australia, and I'm glad I read it. And so I'll throw that in there as a fun book to read. All right, as I finish this out, I want to go ahead and just give you my 3 warnings for books that I didn't particularly enjoy. Maybe you do enjoy them, and I feel bad if I'm going to go ahead and say something bad about one of your favorite books, but one of those books that I just didn't like very much was Verity by Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover is all the rage right now. If I was a trendier reader, I'd probably be reading all sorts of Colleen Hoover books. This is the first one I've read. I think I've got another one on the shelf behind me here that I'm going to read called Ugly Love. Verity, just did not enjoy it. I don't understand. If Colleen Hoover writes books like this all the time, I just don't know why she's so popular. I just didn't get it. The next one I have on here is going to probably surprise some of you because it's considered a classic, and that's Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights, just don't get that one either. This whole thing of a brooding guy who goes around and can't communicate, and everybody falls in love with him because he's such a brooding, man who can't utter a sentence. I just don't find that very romantic. I don't understand why Heathcliff is some romantic hero to a lot of people. Just didn't get it. I just wanted to slap Heathcliff most of the time in this book and say, just start talking, use your words, get over yourself. Don't understand. I just don't understand what the appeal of Heathcliff is. Thus, I didn't really like this book. And then the last one I have on this list is The Love Hypothesis, that was written in 2022 or came out in 2022. And the author here is actually a neuroscientist, and I think she even studied social neuroscience. So you might think that I would be very pro about this. And in fact, the book has all sorts of academic references to it, and you can clearly tell that the author knows the lay of the land of getting a PhD, what it's like to go to an academic conference, what neuroscience is like, and so on. The problem I had with this book was that the main relationship takes place between a graduate student and a professor. And even though the professor doesn't directly advise the graduate student, his colleague is very much involved with her fate. He's involved in departmental politics involving her fate. I just don't see anything appealing about a student dating a professor. And if anything, I thought this was a morality story to show you what goes wrong when a student dates a professor, how it could go horribly wrong. So I don't want to get too preachy about this, but I think that's just why I couldn't enjoy the book as much as I would like to. I thought the writing was funny and crisp, and I enjoyed lots of the details, like I said, about academics in it. But I think the overall story of a student falling in love with a professor just isn't something we should be doing these days. I think we're moving on and realizing there's all these power differentials and relationships that shouldn't be happening in this kind of story. All right, so there you go. Those are my recommendations from the books I read in 2022. I hope you liked these recommendations. You found this worth it. I put a link to all of these books down below. So if you are interested in any of these titles, you'll find them in the description below, and you can click on them and it takes you right to Amazon where you can order the book. But I also want to thank you for watching this. And if you liked it, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you around.